everybody. Welcome to Ask the Pastor. My name is Matt Love. I am here with Pastor J.D. Greer. JD, time-honored tradition with Ask the Pastor since we started recording it. I'm not where I normally am. You're just so consistent, and I'm evergreen, always in one spot. And I'm somewhere else. So I apologize to everybody for the lack of consistency. You look like you're in the computer lab of a middle school. That's exactly where I am. I'm in my office. So good stuff. But all right, JD, we have a good question today that was asked, I believe, by multiple people sent this in. So clearly it's on some people's minds. And it's a question I've heard, kind of dealt with or engaged with in different times. So, JD, is it okay for Christians to do yoga? And I'll just say, my wife waits with bated breath to hear your answer. As long as LeBron James is the one leading it, the answer is yes. Okay. No, that is a great question. I actually have heard on it a lot. We've touched it on Ask the Pastor before briefly. Mostly we use it as an example of talking about a bigger issue, which is the issue of how to handle issues of conscience that aren't spelled out directly in Scripture, which I'll actually talk about that a little bit again at the end here. Okay. But let's just take a couple minutes and talk about why this is a controversial topic, because I would imagine, especially some of our younger listeners may say, what could possibly be wrong with doing yoga? I mean, it's just stretching and breathing techniques but there's let's take a moment and think historically for a minute. Without any question, uncontroversially, yoga has roots in Eastern religion, particularly in Hinduism and Buddhism, which were accompanied historically by spiritual practices aimed at enlightenment or union with the divine. Obviously, Buddhists and Hindus do not conceive of God the way that Christians do, but it was kind of a way of getting in touch with this larger divinity that was in and around us. Yoga was often intertwined with meditation, both it was and it is. That can be confusing because it has become really vogue right now in the Christian life in an appropriate way to talk about the spiritual disciplines and practice of meditation and silence. And, those things have long Christian roots as well. And that's a great thing. And so Christians in some ways have used some of these practices when it comes to meditation and silence and that kind of stuff, used them for centuries. So, isn't this just like, the same thing by another name? We have to be very careful to draw a distinction between the meditation as it's conceived by an Eastern religion like Hinduism and what godly meditation looks like. A big distinction is going to be that, in Eastern meditation, you're clearing your mind. And in Scripture meditation, you're actually filling your mind with what God says in His Word. Scripture would actually say it's never good to get totally in touch with just what's in your heart, because Mark 7, Jesus said it's from within, from the heart of man. That's where all the evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, all this stuff comes from inside of you. And so we don't want to be listening to what's in our minds when the Bible is talking about silence and meditation. Is talking about letting the revealed word of Scripture from the outside come into our hearts, because we need salvation has to come from outside of us, enlightenment. Union with the divine, that stuff comes because we're responding to the revelation of God. And so we just think of meditation in entirely different ways. Similar to this, Matt, would be yoga will often emphasize emptying the mind, while Scripture tells us to fill our minds with the things of the Spirit. The wrong kind of meditation is when you're trying to aim at some kind of higher state of consciousness. The right kind of meditation is when you're looking at deepening your relationship with God and your awareness of His character. Another problematic thing that some people have with yoga is that, a lot of the poses, even extremely common ones, were originally designed as acts of, genuflection, I think is the $10 word, towards some kind of Hindu deity. Even the term yoga, it means yoked. Suggesting that it traditionally yokes one to Brahman, which is the Hindu creator. For some Christians, that makes them just not want to do it at all. Others would say, well, none of this is more of a Romans 14 issue. In Romans 14, you've got this issue where a lot of the Roman Jewish Christians didn't want to eat the meat that had been offered to idols because they said the idol's power had tainted the meat, and they just felt it was that you were participating with the idol if you did that. Other Christians, and Paul was in this category, said no. Just because it was offered to an idol, Jesus is stronger than any idol.
idol. Idols aren't really gods. And so, you're free to eat the meat because Jesus has made it clean for you. What Paul said is, even though he had his conviction on it, he didn't want that to be a matter of controversy. I know it's not an exact one-to-one comparison, but there are some similarities in this. You've got some that are really disturbed and think you can't use downward dog or, what the different, kind of warrior poses and that, because they originated from pagan things and breathing techniques. And others say, well, we can still use the breathing techniques and the poses, even though they come from those things, because, we are now doing them in a way that honors Christ. Yep. I would put this, Matt, definitely in the category of things that a believer is supposed to, wrestle with in their own conscience, Romans 14, and come to a conviction on. So I would put it there.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to kind of land on this question. And maybe you mentioned this a second ago, but I know occasionally one of the pieces of feedback I'll hear about certain episodes of the podcast is, oh, JD didn't really answer the question. But I think most of the time it's because you're trying to really articulate this is an issue where there is some conscience. And it's not always that way. It's maybe not even most of the time that way. But there are certain questions that are that way. But JD, I think what could be helpful, and again, you alluded to this, but what is kind of your framework for determining when something is at that conscience level versus maybe a little bit more important than that?
Yeah, great question. Real quick, before I answer that, can I respond to just something you said? Is that I actually think with ask, I realize it's always easier just to be like, I say no, I say yes, but I would rather us learn how to think about these things. And a lot of times that means, I want to be clear where the Bible's clear, but I also want to help people learn to think and wrestle with it, and even think sympathetically about people who come to a different conclusion than you do. And so, if somebody's out there and they're like, well, no, because it has any roots in Hinduism, we can't even use the poses. I would say, do you realize how much of what we do day to day, if you trace it back, is going to, lots of people pointed out that a lot of our Christmas elements and traditions go back to ancient pagan traditions. The word we use for God, Matt, God, actually comes from the German word Gott, which originally referred to a pagan deity.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. There you go. That's a big fact. That's crazy.
Right. So, that doesn't mean that our, conception of God, it's like there are things that we can use, like the things in Romans 14, and say Jesus is stronger and I'm not honoring this false deity. But the question you asked specifically, maybe we should do an Ask the Pastor on why don't you always answer the question? That would have been, we tucked in a free one in this one.
2 for 1.
Yeah, 2 for 1. There's a Australian theologian named Michael Bird, who I don't agree with on everything, but he has a really helpful framework for how to think about different issues. Real quick, because this could be another whole podcast. But category 1 for him are what he calls matters essential for salvation. Things you really need to believe if you're going to be a Christian. Like, I don't know how you could be a Christian and not do that. Think, the Trinity and the way of salvation, doctrines of Christ and that sort of thing. Then you got category 2, which are matters that are important to the faith, but not necessarily essential for salvation. Meaning, I think they're very important, and the unity of the church depends on these, but it's conceivable they could get this wrong and, still be, very much in love with Jesus. Think, obviously, questions about church polity. I put complementarianism, kind of how we understand those roles, and the inerrancy of the Bible, I put in there. They're very, very important. They're not all equally important, but they're all very important. But it's possible to be wrong about them and still be saved. I would say things in category 1 and 2 are things that, at least in a local church, you got to be unified on.
Yes.
Even things that aren't necessary for salvation, in order for us to have just cohesive fellowship, we got to agree on these. Category 3, I think Michael Bird calls them matters of indifference. I think of them, I actually prefer Paul's words, disputed matters. Yeah. And that's going to include less clear things in the Bible, which I would think of as, things like the finer points of Calvinism or the details of when and how Jesus comes back. I would also put in this category the application of biblical principles, questions like what modesty is, best way to educate your children, what political candidate to vote for, lots of things here. I would put this question about yoga in that latter category, that disputed matters. Now, here's the thing. When Paul gives the instructions in Romans 14, he doesn't tell you that these are just, who cares? That's why I don't like Michael Bird's matters of indifference. Paul has a very clear conviction about why he thinks eating meat that had been offered to idols is okay. So he says, let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. That's verse 5. That's part of spiritual maturity. But then he also says you should be patient with those who don't see these disputed matters like you do. Even if you think they're wrong, be patient with them. He would never say that about issues related to the gospel or the doctrine of God. He would say, hey, look, you've got to believe this, and if not, then you're in error. But these disputed matters, he would say, be patient because, ultimately this person answers to God on this. And then the last thing here, and I'll land the plane, is that, Paul says, he just puts such a high value on unity in this that he says, yeah, it'd be great if everybody saw questions about yoga and where the best place to educate your kids and what candidates to vote for like I did. But when it comes to those things in category 3, I put more of an emphasis on the unity of the church and the forward progress of the gospel than I do strict conformity in every jot and tittle of those questions. And I put yoga in that category.
Yeah. Well, and JD, another thing I think I've heard you say about this kind of idea is, even in that, just on a personal level, don't violate your own conscience, right? Like if you kind of feel like one of these things is you can't do it in good conscience, then that's okay. That's good. Don't violate that. For whatever reason, that's something that the Spirit might be saying. But I think this is a really helpful framework because I think a lot of these issues, categorizing them correctly allows us to be able to engage with others on them in the right way, and have the best type of kind of engagement around us. So
tell Lindsay, your wife, that she's free to do warrior pose, downward dog, cobra, but she's got to be listening to one of my sermons when she does that. That's the only way.
She needs to set her mind on the Spirit. This is actually I put this on the whiteboard behind me, JD. But this is my thing for the podcast. Is WWJDSJWD? What would JD say Jesus would do? That's kind of what I'm always trying to think in my mind.
Wait, I'm going on right now and seeing if that website is bought. www.ww.
No one would ever be able to type it in correctly. So, well, thanks everybody for joining us on Ask the Pastor today. Thanks, JD, so much. As always, go ahead and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, YouTube, j.d.greer. If you listen on Spotify or wherever else you listen, go ahead and subscribe there. This podcast is produced by J.D. Greer Ministries. And next week, we're going to have a great question about whether denominations are biblical. So we'll see you next time on Ask the Pastor.